Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We are going to be looking at data and diversity, a critical conversation about numbers, inclusion, and equity. My name is Alissa Sklar. I am the VP of Marketing at GIS Planning. I'm delighted to welcome you all here today. Appreciate you taking time out of your busy days. And with that, I am thrilled to welcome our presenters today. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. We have Tony Delisi from EY Advisory Services. We have Peter Chapman from Urban Policy Innovations and Anatolia Ubalde from GIS Planning and Size Up. Hello, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
We are delighted to have you all here. We're going to get started with everyone. I've asked everyone to spend a few minutes talking about the subject from the perspective that interests them based on the work that they do. And so I guess we're going to start off with you, Tony. I'm going to turn this over to you, and you can share with us. I'm just going to stop the main screen in the meantime and just leave our webcams up for now.
Well, thanks, and I'm really excited to be here. I know, at EY, we work on a lot of different things, and I'm really passionate about economic development, which is our main focus. And we work with a lot of different communities, and this topic has been coming up for a number of years, and I think it's so critical. I'm going to talk a little bit big picture here, but I always like to take the step back and there's a quote that says, what gets measured matters. And I think as economic developers, as policymakers, we often focus on overall metrics of a community's health. We'll talk about GDP, median household income, poverty, educational attainment, and more. But when we're talking about the overall health of a community, it can obscure the fact that each community is usually made up of many different communities, and they're not all having the same experience. And by not measuring this difference in experience, in many ways, we're saying that those experiences don't matter. And this might feel familiar to many people that could be on this call who've historically been made to feel invisible or as if their lives don't matter. And to some degree, this is reflective of an approach that we've had, at least in America, for many years of color blindness, of saying that difference isn't as important. We're going to look at the overall. And when we're having conversations about equity and inclusion, it's critical that we talk about difference. And a great place to start looking at difference is by talking about the outcomes, the economic outcomes for different groups within a community. These conversations can be really challenging because they really get into those differences in experience that people are having. And most importantly, that begins to start the next conversation, which is about why are different outcomes occurring? Why do we see differences between median income for Black communities or white communities? Why is educational attainment different for Latinx communities versus non-Latinx communities in our different places? And these are really tough conversations to have. And personally, I really love the book How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi, and he has a definition for racism. It's just one example of difference, but saying that racism is the policies and practices that lead to divergent outcomes for people along racial lines. And I was at an event many years ago, and there was a speaker, and she said, it's really stand out to me that people often ask me if racism exists in my community. And I say, look at the data. And the truth is that systemic racism in this definition is prevalent. There are few communities that are truly equal. And when we look at the data, you will see inequalities, inequities, differences, and they manifest in many different ways in each community. And it's so important that we take that data and we start to look at it, that we use that to move forward to other conversations that can help bring us together, where we can say, why are these existing? That we can start working towards that definition of anti-racism, which is looking at our policies and our practices to reduce those disparities. What can we do to make a difference here? I really think this is foundational to a lot of the work that we're doing across the country with different communities, and it's so critical. I know we've been working with Oklahoma City, with Cleveland, done work in Chattanooga, and many other places where they really say we can't ignore these differences that we see occurring in our communities, and we need to dig in, bring people to the table, from all of our different groups, all our different geographies, and really understand how can we bridge these gaps and change our policies and our procedures and our practices to really reduce disparity across the board. So that's my take, but I just love that we're having this conversation and looking at all the different ways that data can be important to these critical conversations.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Already taking notes as you're speaking, and some things occur to me, but I think we're going to go through all of the different presenters first, and then we'll come back to that and pick up on some common threads. Thank you so much, Tony. Peter, I will turn this over to you.
Great. Just
We've got your Gmail up, so probably on the bottom, the PowerPoint. There you go.
there it is. Great. Can everyone see it?
Yep, we sure can.
Okay. So it's always nice to follow my partner, collaborator, and friend, Tony Delisi. Worked with Tony across several of those markets that he just mentioned. And Alissa, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. So this is a topic that is extremely important to me. So having been a community and economic development practitioner for a couple of decades, one of the issues that we wrestle with constantly is how do we empower neighborhood-based constituencies, a diverse set of constituencies, to use data in a way that will inform very positive outcomes. So Tony's overview provided great context for what I want to talk about, which are really some leading practices in how selected grassroots, community-based stakeholders have used and are presently using neighborhood data to support community improvement activities, primarily in low-income areas. So I'm not going to go through each slide in gross detail, but what I want to do is give you a very, very high-level overview of a multi-city initiative called Monitoring Neighborhood Change, which was supported by what's called the National Neighborhood Indicators Project, which is really an initiative of the Urban Institute think tank in DC that was set up to help local stakeholders really utilize data more effectively to monitor neighborhood change and ultimately affect policy outcomes that positively impact neighborhood conditions. So it's a very important overarching model because it's really about taking these very high level concepts and data sets and really applying them in a very practical way to local problem solving. And I've been around in this space long enough to remember when economic inclusion, DEI, was really called comprehensive neighborhood revitalization or comprehensive community development. So the Monitoring Neighborhood Change initiative was supported by a number of national and regional entities, including the philanthropic arms of the Federal Reserve Bank. Just to give you a little background and context for this effort, and the initiative was really inspired by a desire among local practitioners and neighborhood residents to better understand the dynamics of displacement caused by gentrification. So that's the broad overview. So this slide is something I've already covered, and also in the way of background, this is an issue that I've addressed in a number of different contexts. So not only as a practitioner, but as an advisor to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. So this is just the first page of one of the early national case studies, indicators-based case studies focused on what's called, or what was called at that time, the Federal Hope 6 program, which was really a comprehensive neighborhood revitalization initiative. Going to the next slide, this multi-city initiative, it really focused on 5 cities. I'm not going to go through all 5 cities, of course, but I want to focus on a few initiatives in the former Rust Belt, which is where my practice is based. So I want to start with Buffalo, and again, this is very, very high level. So the local stakeholders there, again, supported by the National Neighborhood Indicators Project, but it also involved several local and regional groups. You know, they really focused on collecting and cataloging census block data, you know, that captured a broad array of information, including building permits, tax foreclosures, you know, even the investment of federal community investment dollars. So the CDBG program, the HOME program, which are tools for facilitating community development in a number of cities across the country. And their findings led them to recommend, you know, really a process, an early warning system, if you will, to identify areas with increasing risk of displacement. So spatial geographical areas in the city that were at risk of displacement. The other market that factored prominently in this initiative is my home city of Detroit. So as some of our viewers or participants may know, Detroit is a city that has been undergoing a great deal of change over the last, I would say, 6 to 8 years, and most of that change is really centered within and around the central business district and Midtown. And so that is placing a great deal of pressure on surrounding neighborhoods. So displacement pressure caused by increasing property values, which affect residents as well as commercial tenants. So the Detroit initiative really concentrated on measures of displacement, you know, in very, very selected neighborhoods, and those measures were really used to inform the creation of an index that local stakeholders are still trying to convince city officials and local officials, and foundation officials to use in their public policy activities. That's the bottom line. And so the Detroit initiative is still very much underway. And what they did was, just to give you a little bit more detail, this neighborhood change index that they created really focused on 18 block level indicators that would help local stakeholders really assess and make informed determinations as to really what was happening, you know, in their communities. And I've listed here some of the critical indicators that the index follows. And so that is Detroit, my home city. Coming into the home stretch, I also want to talk about Milwaukee, which is another very interesting former Rust Belt city whose neighborhoods have been undergoing some measure of change, particularly those areas that are close to the central business district and the greater downtown. So again, not getting too deep in the weeds here. We can talk about some of this during Q&A. The indicators that were used by local stakeholders in Milwaukee were similar to the indicators that were used in Detroit. And based on the analysis of the data, local stakeholders were really we're really able to begin in earnest the process of working with city officials on displacement mitigation strategies. That's the bottom line there. And just to conclude the slide deck, the big takeaway is that the Monitoring Neighborhood Change initiative really served as a great vehicle for empowering local stakeholders, including neighborhood residents, local business owners, thereby allowing them to better understand the dynamics of gentrification and really make informed policy recommendations for displacement prevention and mitigation. And finally, I will say that this is not a static initiative. The data collection part of it is not currently underway, but the policy development and policy implementation elements of this initiative are very much still underway. So with that said, I will pause and yield the floor to Anatolio.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time, your presentation, Peter. Anatolio, I'm going to pass this over to you. I know that you have slides to share as well. We can't hear you. You're muted. You know that, okay. There we go. We can see your slides.
Yeah, when you turned it over, it didn't allow me to unmute. So great. I'm really happy to talk with you all about this. I am going to thank you, Tony and Peter, for really providing all of that context in terms of how data can be used. I'm going to be talking about who gets access to data. And because that has implications, if you can't access it, then how do you use the data to solve your problems? So what I am going to discuss today is quantifying the digital divide for marginalized populations, how information poverty negatively impacts economic development, and then if there is time later on, maybe in the Q&A, about some program solutions to reduce information poverty. And this isn't something that has been talked about a lot in our profession, but information poverty has a big impact. And I'm going to start with talking about the digital divide. Now, technology and the internet have been positioned as a utopian path to digital democracy and a level playing field. However, this egalitarian idea does not align with the bifurcated reality. Instead, technology, data, and the internet have disproportionately benefited those who are already most privileged. Instead of equality, it's enabled greater inequality. Not everyone has, uses, or knows how to use technology. Effective targeting of economic development assistance to bridge the digital divide requires a quantified understanding of who's in need. And so that's what I want to do, is try and quantify some of that right now. When we look at income, the digital lives of lower and higher income Americans is very different. About 3 in 10 adults with household incomes below $30,000 don't own a smartphone. More than 4 in 10 don't have broadband services or home broadband services or a traditional computer. And a majority of lower income Americans are not tablet owners. By comparison, each of these technologies is nearly ubiquitous among adults in households earning $100,000 or more a year. Higher income people are more likely to have multiple devices to go online, whereas many lower income people have to rely on their smartphones to go online. This is called being underconnected. This forces low-income people to use their phones for tasks that are typically reserved for large screens, such as applying for jobs online. And this also impacts students because 35% of lower-income households with school-age children did not have a broadband internet connection at home. And you can imagine how that impacted us during a time of COVID when folks are forced to be at home. Okay? So this also impacts continuous access uncertainty because a third of families with mobile-only access quickly hit the data limits on their mobile phone plans, and about a quarter have their phone services cut off for lack of payment. We can also look at this issue by geography, and we can see that rural residents have made gains in closing the gap with digital technology, but are still 12 percentage points less likely than Americans overall to have home broadband. They're also less likely to have a smartphone, tablet, or laptop computer than suburban or urban adults. There are about 15% of rural adults that never go online, compared to 9% living in urban communities, and 6% were in the suburbs. And even if they do have access, the speeds tend to be slower. Now, as troubling as rural adoption might be, the urban situation is 3 times as bad. Urban adoption is a factor of consumer adoption. It's more than geography. A larger driver of non-adoption is the household costs of monthly broadband fees and the expense of a computer. This shows that even a household that has physical infrastructure to access broadband, it won't if it can't afford, they can't afford to use it. Let's look at this issue by race. Black and Hispanic adults are less likely than whites to own a traditional computer or have high-speed internet at home. 82% of whites own a desktop or laptop computer, compared to 58% for blacks and 57% for Hispanics. 79% of whites have broadband at home, compared to 66% for blacks and 61% for Hispanics. So smartphones really is a key method for blacks and Hispanics to access the internet, information, and looking for work. However, blacks, Hispanics, and lower income smartphone users are about twice as likely as whites to have canceled or cut off service because of the cost. This disruption of access can be devastating because mobile devices play a larger role for Black and Hispanic populations, as 25% for Hispanic and 23% of Blacks are smartphone only, which means they own a smartphone but lack traditional home broadband service. That's only 20% for whites that are smartphone only. You can also see this issue by education. This becomes pretty stark. You can see from this graphic. The less educated a household has, the less likely the home uses the internet at all or has a computer. Only 71% of people with less than a high school education use the internet, compared to 98% for college graduates. If a household is less familiar with computing devices, even smartphones or tablets, they're less likely to know how much valuable information is available online, much of which is free. Non-adapting parents may also not realize how important the internet has become for students, especially in underperforming schools. Those without internet services are more likely to be heavy users of government services and may be unaware that many of those services are online. In addition, for those that have never been online or spent less time online, they may not be aware of opportunities broadband offers for job skills, health information, smarter shopping, civic engagement, or using e-government services as an alternative to the costly process of visiting government offices in person. We look at this issue as it relates to jobs. What we find is that in 517 of 545 US occupations, the use of digital skills has increased 50% on average, and this is measured from 2002 to 2016. Jobs with digital skills are growing, paying higher wages, and are more resilient. Whites remain overrepresented in high-level digital occupations such as engineering and management, as well as the medium-level digital areas such as business and finance, the arts, legal, and education professions. Blacks are overrepresented in medium digital occupations such as office and administrative support, community and social services, and low digital level jobs such as transportation, personal care, building and grounds maintenance. Hispanics are significantly underrepresented in high-level digital, technical, business, finance, and somewhat underrepresented in medium-level legal, sales, and education jobs. Men also continue to dominate the highest level digital occupations such as computer, education, and management fields. Women represent about 3/4 of the workforce in many of the medium digital occupational groups, such as healthcare, office admin, and education. The gap of women working in the tech industry, which creates digital products and services, is really significant. Facebook, Google, and Apple have 17%, 19%, and 23%, respectively, of women in their technology staff. Multiple surveys, such as one that's called The Elephant in the Valley, have documented systemic discrimination against women. So what does this create? It creates this cycle of income poverty. As research from US Department of HUD explains, As information services and resources increasingly move online, digital inequality has come to both reflect and contribute to other persistent forms of social inequality. Disparate access to the internet and digital devices corresponds closely with longstanding inequalities in income, education, race, ethnicity, immigration status, and geography. At the same time, the negative consequences of being underconnected are growing, and researchers and policymakers are increasingly concerned that underconnection is fueling these other disparities. So broadband and having access to the right devices, this impacts education, employment, health, social service, the production and dissemination of knowledge, and how you can consume it. Yet those who are most in need of these things are those who are most removed from the access. So these trends suggest that digital access will play an increasingly central role in socioeconomic inclusion. Now, limited access to internet and computing devices, as all the data that I showed you before, is a barrier to becoming digitally skilled and a long-term barrier to the economic opportunities of better quality jobs that increasingly require digital skills. But it also impacts communities, and I know many of the folks who are on this webinar, well, your job is serving communities. And the places, the local economies that are less digitally savvy, or those that are more digitally savvy, the more digitally savvy it is, the better the wages. So communities that do not increase information access through the internet and computer devices risk geographic economic exclusion if the highest paying jobs and greatest economic output are created in tech savvy regions of the world, while other regions are left behind. So with that, I'm going to bring it to a close, and we can get back to everybody else.
Okay,
Please
wow.
take
Thank
away
you.
my screen sharing.
I will take away your screen sharing. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So I love the presentations here. What I'm hearing are some there's obviously a very complex issues here. We're talking about data both from the perspective of who gets counted, what questions get asked in the collection of data, who asks those questions, how is that accounted for, analyzed, disseminated, how does it fit back to policy decisions, as you were talking about, Tony? And then also from the flip side is who gets access to data, and what does that mean in terms of life opportunities, life choices? The pandemic clearly highlighted a lot of that inequity. I think we've all heard many stories about that and made that clear. And I can say I'm up in Canada. These issues are not limited, of course, to the US. These are countries around the world are dealing with this. Up in Canada, as of November 30th, the only way back into the country if you cross into the US is with an app. And that app obviously requires some facility. You need to know how to upload your vaccination status or your test results status. And there are now already stories of people who couldn't figure that out, who are penalized by thousands of dollars in fines or forced to quarantine for 2 weeks just because they didn't know how to use the app. So obviously there's whole swaths of people who are going to have difficulty with those things. So access to data, use of data is definitely impacting on a daily level many people. I'm actually going to start by asking you a question, Peter, actually, because we're talking about the collection of data, and I'm really interested in what you're describing in these case studies are very grassroots, local initiatives, residents, business owners, people on the ground who are living these things, who are asked these questions. Who gets to define what questions get asked? Is that something that communities together workshop, or how do we know?
Yeah, those decisions are really made via a collective involving entities consisting of, economic development organizations, community development corporations, philanthropies, and even more grassroots groups. So my research of this particular initiative that I highlighted, suggests that there was very time-consuming and painstaking thought and effort put into ensuring that there was, really keen representation of those local groups that would ultimately determine what data got collected and analyzed and synthesized.
Okay, it's a very interesting question. I know I'm in here in Montreal. We had a similar kind of project going on, and it became clear after the first round of results collection, is that the unhoused population was not surveyed, no data was collected about them. So when we're talking about displacement, there were just a whole set of voices that weren't included at all. And so it's interesting to have people on the ground be part of that decision making, because they're seeing things that may not be seen from the top down, let's say from local leadership even.
That's correct. That is correct.
So my next question.
It's interesting, Alyssa. I was just going to say, with those things, it really highlights, I think this goes to what we've all spoken a bit too, is that the need to create that data often in certain circumstances. I was, lucky enough to be a part of the point in time count here in the US a couple of times, where we count the homeless population once a year and go around the whole country, where there's individuals on the ground actually walking around at night trying to meet and identify and do a census of the people that are unhoused. And there's so many challenges with this at many times where the data doesn't exist for these, especially super local concerns, and that need to start collecting it to get people grassroots out there, putting the numbers together and giving us some basis to understand what's really happening.
Well, it's so critical because, as you said at the very beginning, in order to make policy decisions, you can't ignore differences, but sometimes we don't even know about the differences if they haven't been assessed in any kind of way. So that first set of questions need to be asked.
Well, they can be very obscured. I was impressed by Anatolia sharing your story, because I know, the US Census, you often see stats that say computers and households. Underlying that is that they're counting smartphones as computers. You have to see a data set below that to separate computers and smartphones to see that 22% of American households don't have a computer. And that's 1 in 5 people. Most people have no idea that that 1 in 5 folks that they meet are living without a computer, and that's a huge barrier to overcome.
Tony, you said something that I thought was really powerful, and I'm glad you said it. He said, "Is there racism? Look at the data." And so, I guess my question to you is there's that some people think about it so broadly, like, oh, societal, the country, the world. Can you tell me a little bit about how do you looking at that in your community? Where is the data to look at that's local?
Yeah, that's a good one. And I'll just caution this with, like, it can be triggering to some folks to hear a statement like that. And I think it's important in my definition, and the way I like to use this, that we're talking about racism not as an individual's feelings about somebody else based on the color of their skin, which is a very real and intense concern, but instead, structural racism, systemic racism, those policies, procedures that have created difference in our communities that aren't, based on nothing biological about us. And the way that I think we can see this, a really great example would be the PPP loans that were given out during the COVID last year. And we can look and see very clearly, there's a lot of analysis that happened. The data that's given by the government, we can see where they were given out. And so that alone, we can look and see, oh, you can know this in a different community, that more PPP loans were given out in neighborhoods that are predominantly white. And this plays out in many different communities. Other surveys have shown too that we've got a high denial rate for businesses owned by people of color. And so the first step is saying, okay, how are PPP loans distributed in our community? Oh, wow, this neighborhood did not get any PPP loans. What happened there? And so the next step is to go in and meet with business owners and say, did you apply? Why were you denied? What were the reasons? And start to understand what some of those barriers might be to accomplishing that. Educational attainment or computer access are other great ones. If we see massive differences in educational attainment, you start to ask, why did that happen? Why is it only 20% for or you often see much lower, 10% with bachelor's degree or higher among our Latinx population, but it's 40% for our white population.
Yeah.
There are reasons that that's happening, and it's really trying to dig in and have those meetings and figure out why.
And Atolio, another resource that is available, to community development practitioners and others that helps to inform our understanding of racial disparities is the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data, the HMDA data, that looks across a number of different areas of lending activity from commercial lending institutions, banks, anyone who is in the business of providing capital, of providing loans for brick and mortar projects, particularly housing. So I, over the last several decades, I have found that data to be, while imperfect, extremely compelling in terms of understanding or enabling us to understand the economic and racial disparities that occur in critical areas of community development and access to capital. Very, very powerful data set.
Thank you.
Just a reminder also to our participants, if anyone has any questions for any of the panelists or on the subject matter in general, please feel free to put that in the questions field in the GoToWebinar control panel, and I'll be sure to share that with everyone else here. As I was listening to you all, I was thinking also about who gets to use this data and who chooses not to. And I was put in mind, GIS Planning is a data company. We put data into mapping software that economic developers can use. And when I was working with a client a little while ago, they represent a poorer region, and they were feeling uncomfortable about having some of the demographic and consumer spending and taxation data displayed on their website, as if, feeling that this would be a disincentive to investors, or that this wasn't something that they necessarily wanted to promote and make readily available. Now, clearly, you can't hide this data. It definitely exists there. Anyone who's going to invest in a location is going to dig out the information they need to make a decision. But it also, one of the things I pointed out to them is that for some investors and businesses making location decisions, those exact criteria will represent an opportunity, a reason to move into that area, and that will be something that they're actually looking for. And so we must look at the reality of these things. As you said at the very beginning, Tony, you can't ignore differences. You just need to understand that they're there and figure out, obviously in terms of policy, but also in terms of investment decision. What do you think about the idea that there is data there, but willingly not shared some of the time?
I would love to answer this. I think I have a couple takes on it, and I would say you can't ignore data. People do ignore data. I think it's to the detriment of a community, of its health and its people. Just because if you're ignoring some of these situations and looking it in the face, you're denying the lived experience of people in your communities, and that alone is disempowering and not going to help move your community forward from creating economic opportunity for everybody and so forth. And I truly believe that sharing information whenever we have this is always in the benefit of the community, even if it appears negative. And it's going to lead to tough but important conversations. It'll empower people to address issues and be seen. But then from a business development and investment standpoint, the same token, I've been at, we have a site selection branch of Ernst & Young and efforts working with businesses choosing locations, as well as us doing strategic planning. And I've heard this from site locators, from businesses across the board, but they want to see your authentic self, bruises and all. And the truth is they're going to see it, they can find this information, they know what's going on. And it's much better to recognize that there are challenges in your community and show that you're talking about them, that you're working on them, that you know these things exist and see them as a part of who you are and something that needs to be tackled, versus trying to cover it up or hide it away, which is inevitably you're presenting an inauthentic version of your community. You're silencing the voices of people that are affected by whatever that data represents. And I just firmly believe that it's not a good idea to look away from these things.
Peter or Natalia, any thoughts about that, about ways in which data can be maybe hidden or used to deflect in some cases?
I think that, you pointed out the new reality, which is you can't hide it. You can hide it from your website, but that doesn't mean that there aren't millions of other sources where you can get information. And those conversations are happening through data, through folks who have access to data, public sector data, private sector data. The conversations that happen on social media is also exposing that. So I think that the idea of hiding information is based on an old view of how you do economic development communication or marketing, which is I control the message of what everybody will think about my community. If I spend enough on the marketing, people will believe what I say. But Tony points out you need to be authentic because, in fact, everybody can access that authentic information. Now, here's something. If you don't like that data and what the data is saying, here's an idea for economic development. Why don't you fix it? Right? Why don't you make your community better, which I think economic developers are doing, and to say this is where we are and this is where we want to get to, and you, the investor, whether it's the local entrepreneur or the business who's doing an expansion, you are part of the solution to get here, and let's be partners in that.
Yeah. So ditto to what Tony and Anatolio just said, but just to add an additional thought to it. I think we ignore data at our peril, as practitioners, as advisors to practitioners, and really to the detriment of communities. I think in this era, economic development requires a really holistic, multidisciplinary focus. So if you have data that really illuminates some gaps and some needs, then it is incumbent upon us as creative economic developers, hopefully, to market that data in a way that will, for example, foster more philanthropic investment, foster more federal investment. If the data suggests that a particular community or region, is underserved, it may then pique the interest of certain types of real estate investors or certain types of retailers. And so I think we should not ignore data. We should look at how we can leverage the data, whatever the data say, to attract and diversify the network of stakeholders and investors that can improve communities, regions, so forth and so on. So,
right, it can be entrepreneurial and business solutions to some of these issues. The typical example of the food desert. Well, there's an opportunity for a food retailer or to find their place in there. And what will that attract once you have that anchor in there? I cut someone off. Sorry.
Yeah, this goes to what you just said as well. And I don't think all of this, you made me think, Peter, in this conversation too, about the importance of using this data to track your progress. I mean, Peter, with your monitoring examples that you were sharing and others, that too often we're engaging in strategic work, but not looking at our data continuously and reflecting on it and monitoring our success because we're afraid, I think, too, that we're not going to see progress. But it's so important that if we don't see movement and if we don't see progress, that we recognize that and have these conversations and say, hey, maybe what we're doing isn't working. And that's not bad. That means we tried something and we need to make an adjustment. I'm trying to recall, I read a really great report last year. It was about failing upward and the importance that we have to take shots that we're probably going to fail at. And that's how we learn, and that's how we improve, and that's how we adjust as communities. And the data might look bad, like this did not work. That's not the end of the world. That's good. That teaches us that we need to adjust our tactics, come up with other strategies, and look at these things more. And so, I don't think there is bad data. It's I think that poor reactions to it would be more my take on it.
So if we're I like the idea of failing forward. We got to try things and base base decision making and policy and business decisions on the data that we've got. So what are some of the solutions to the problems? You all identified some problems in different capacities. What can we do to move forward?
Okay, I'll go first. Well, as it relates to information poverty, I'll give some kind of at a high level. I think one solution is public broadband, because private broadband has led to exclusion of communities by geography and income and things like that. Now, as it relates to public broadband, there's going to be folks who are like, oh, that's socialism. Well, think of it more in terms of it being a utility. Water, sewer, roadways. The internet and access to the internet is something that's so important that most people would rather, give up. Well, the studies say there's a group of people who'd rather give up sex than give up their smartphone. So this, I think, is a pretty important thing, yeah? And on the issue of it being socialism, no, even like the American Conservative, a publication, came out saying, hey, places being fleeced by telecoms, and you, the government, are allowing this. So this is not a left or right issue. A second solution is about having data for entrepreneurs. So much of my professional career has really been around democratizing information. On the GIS planning side of my work, what we've done is we provide through the local economic development organizations tons of information that people never had access to before, so they can decide what's the best location to start up, expand, or relocate. Then with my work with Size Up, it's been about empowering entrepreneurs so that they can have access to information so they can make smarter decisions based on data. It is, in today's information economy, it is, if your business or you're that aspiring entrepreneur and you don't have access to information, then you're going to have a stunted economy for your business. So I think it's important that economic developers can play a role in liberating this data. Another solution is supporting small businesses. You may say, okay, well, this is just general for small business, but what are the growing small businesses? The growing small businesses are minority and women-owned businesses. They are disproportionately, in a good way, by the way, overachieving. So by supporting small businesses, you're supporting women and minority-owned businesses. Another thing is computers and training. Let's get laptops and broadband in the hands of folks who don't have the income to have those. Because think about this, like economic developers spending $1 million on some incentive for a huge corporation who, frankly, they've got tons of money already. Well, $1 million could buy 4,000 Google Chromebooks, and that's retail prices. Of course, you could negotiate something better than that. And there is data, there's research that shows that when people have access to this in the household, more people get jobs, parents get jobs. There's also the issue of funding. And this gets to what both Peter and Tony have talked about, which is what do you measure? What you measure gets attention. And so economic development is funded, and we have programs that we fund as economic developers. We need to measure those relative to these issues of who are we serving? What are the equity issues? So I think those are some of the things that are the solutions for information poverty.
Yeah, no, those are great points. And just to jump in, so I've got just a few minutes. So one of the reasons I highlighted the Monitoring Neighborhood Change Initiative, which is a project of NNIP, the National Neighborhood Indicators Project, is because I really think that there is some real substantive, meaningful there in terms of bridging this divide between institutions like the Urban Institute, think tanks, and community-based constituencies in terms of how to identify, synthesize, and apply data to policy development. And just imagine if we institutionalized that sort of focus in federal policy, whether you're talking about formula-based programs like CDBG, or whether you're talking about special initiatives like ARPA funding. Imagine if you had a requirement, okay, that local institutions, be they government, nonprofit, quasi-public or private economic development organizations, had some responsibility, okay, to work in a collaborative manner, to help certain constituencies identify and utilize data to track progress in every different area of economic community development, and to really use that data to inform policy. I mean, it is not rocket science. There's an element of complexity to it, obviously, that many of us have been, trying to figure out over the last couple of decades. But this is very achievable stuff. And so where there is a will, proverbially speaking, I think there could be a way.
Yeah, I like all of these ideas are great. I think there's a lot of hard work to be done here, and it's hard. As a strategic planner, it's hard to just say there's the blanket solutions to these challenges, because the challenges can be very unique to a particular city or state or nation or group of people within those for a variety of circumstances. That being said, I think that the solutions are about providing targeted, direct assistance, as well as communication to bridge gaps. Often, too frequently we'll see that there are tremendous resources in some communities, but people that need them are just completely unaware. They're not able to access them for computer reasons that we talked about here, or there's cultural gaps. And the work there really, it's not just saying, hey, we've got a resource, but getting out into neighborhoods, getting into communities, talking to people to understand how you can help them access these. And then there's the step further, once you've bridged some of that awareness gap and access of assisting people. And it's really tough work, the things of understanding, well, why didn't many businesses get PPP loans? Often they required lots of documentation that they hadn't been collecting about their business. Why weren't they collecting that? Not all people grew up in households where they were trained and aware of how to kind of properly document your business and collect information and do these things, or raised in these areas. And so really walking people through those processes. It's the same thing with educational gaps that we've seen in other areas. There's the tough work of getting out in your neighborhoods, in your communities, and helping people move forward. And I hate saying holding their hands, but in many ways it's showing them the ropes and showing them the pathways and how to do these things. And it takes a lot of people, it takes time, and it takes resources. But as we've discussed here, the benefits are tremendous. I mean, we're talking about data, we're talking about diversity and inclusion. And one of the big things I've seen is that we've done so much work to quantify how much we would earn financially as societies, as communities, if we really helped out people that don't have the help they have today. And so, it might seem like an upfront cost now, but we're paying dividends in terms of business growth, in terms of people's lives and the impact that it has, and the reduced tax burden. I mean, so many things here that I really can't say enough the importance of having these conversations, looking at this data in your community, and digging in to affect these things, because this is how we all together move our communities forward for everybody, including those people that most need help.
That's an incredible point. The opportunity cost of not doing this is staggering, really. I know, Peter, that you need to leave a couple moments before as we're approaching the end of our hour together. I just want to know if you have any final words that you'd like to share with us before you have to click out.
No, I think I've expressed all of my all of my pearls of wisdom for the day.
That's fantastic. I appreciate your participation in this. I know that you said that you needed to go a couple minutes before the end, so I thank you very much for your time, for your input, for your valuable perspective and sharing those case studies. As I said at the top of this, I will be sharing contact information for everyone here. So if you are watching and would like to reach out to one of our panelists, you are free to do so. So I thank you very much, Peter. Tony and Anatolio, I thank you guys both very much as well. Did you have any final thoughts or anything that you'd like to share as we bring this to a close?
I have one, which is we need to use data also to overcome prejudice. because I'll just give you an example. My co-founder of GIS Planning, he's from Costa Rica, and when he moved to the US, to the Bay Area, the one thing he was told was, make sure you don't live in Oakland, right? So that is a, and just for those who don't know Oakland is a very high Black population, right? And the fact that that's what is thought about Oakland, actually, that it's a bad place, does not align with, in fact, the realities of what is happening in Oakland. That's prejudice, right? The more we looked into data of like, what are great places for economic opportunity, and where's the labor force that people want, and what's the right mix of industries, Oakland nationally always starts showing up at the top of the list. So it's data that can help overcome some of those prejudices. In fact, I was doing some research with the Size Up tool, which is another project or company that I'm part of, and we were looking at, oh, what are the best opportunities for a specific industry? And Richmond, California, not San Francisco, California, showed up. Now, people would associate, oh, Richmond is, it's not as wealthy. There's lots of minorities, all this kind of stuff. But when you look at the data, like, just because you're not as wealthy as a San Francisco does not mean you're a great place, or just because there's brown people around, I mean, brown people, diversity is a good thing. And I'll share another way of looking at data to overcome people's prejudices is early on, GIS Planning worked with Shorebank, which is in Chicago. And they had realized that one of the problems is not just the data, it's the way the data and the metrics are used. And when you start looking at wealth, communities of color get excluded because we're using standard ways, traditional ways of thinking about what wealth is. When you look at it as the actual amount of wealth per household, not per capita, well, actually per capita was also another good one, but wealth in the household, it was a lot. Or you look at the issue of density. What is the wealth per square acre? Then these areas that were underserved in terms of retail, they make tremendous sense, but you can use the data to make the case for why you make investment.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would just add, I agree with all that and say, data overcoming prejudice and kind of getting us out of our locked in mindsets. And I just have to encourage you that I always say data is so important, and I use it every day. I think it strengthens our arguments. It helps us understand what's going on. But it's often just the first step. I say, let's use this to go out and have that conversation, to point us in the direction where we can meet with the people around us, people we didn't normally meet with, bring others to the table, and really come together and talk about what's happening here. And it sounds weird in this COVID moment, we're all distant still often, but how can we use this data that might show difference and challenges to bring us closer together? Because if we're sitting in our silos over here, we're not actually meeting people that can help us understand what's happening and how to find partners, to find solutions, and to really do this hard work. So I would say let's take that data to get us started, and let's get out here and let's start getting creative and start working together.
What a wonderful, optimistic way to bring this webinar to a close. I think agree with you. The first thing, of course, is just knowing what we need to know, knowing what we don't know, sharing that with the stakeholders who can affect some of these decisions, inviting entrepreneurs and businesses to have access to it because they've got some really creative solutions. And if they know the environments that they are looking at very, very well, they can probably make some excellent decisions that would better serve those communities and the people around them. Thank you so much, Tony, for your perspective. I know I've already had a chance to thank Peter, who had to drop off. Anatolio, it's always a pleasure to include you in this. Thank you also for so much. I loved how all three of you brought these kind of very different perspectives to these very complex issues together, and I really appreciated having you all here with us today. With that, I would also like to thank our attendees. You will be getting a follow-up email with links to the video recording and contact information. Wish you all a wonderful day. Be safe, stay well, take care. Thank you, and goodbye.
Bye.